"I believe I will," she said, and she took the dipper and tilted her head back and drank. She had really been working. The arms of her shirt were sweated halfway down her side, and the tip ends of her hair around her neck were wet. Her old shirt was plastered to her stomach, but she looked like the real thing to me. When she took the dipper down, I leaned over and kissed her, and she reached up to put her hands behind my head, so the dipper dripped water on my shoulder. "You know why I'm glad you come?" she said. "I've been saving something to show you." I grinned. I sure felt good. "What have you got I ain't already seen?" I said. "This, Gid," she said, standing up. She grinned to herself and pulled the ends of her shirt tail up and stuck her stomach out at me. It didn't look much bigger than it ever had, but it looked a little, and I got the message. Besides, she grabbed me and hugged me. "Don't that make you glad?" she said. "We've got one started. That makes me so proud. It's just what I've been wanting." I didn't know what to say. It was okay with me, but I wasn't wildly happy about it like she was. I was more excited about the deed. "Well, sure, Molly," I said, "if it's what you've been wanting. And it's ours for sure?" "It's ours for sure." There was nothing else to say. She was happy enough to faint. She just sort of slid on me. "Well, sugar," I said, after it was too late for it to have done any good, "I don't know about all this. You're so excited about it. We want to be careful and not jar it loose." "This bed's just a puddle of sweat," she said, crawling over me. "I'll get some water and sprinkle it so we'll be cooler." She brought in the dipper and sprinkled the sheets with me in them, and then sat down by me and caught my hand. "It won't jar loose," she said. "I'm so glad the first one is yours. I wouldn't have wanted anybody else's to be the first." "Honey, you're an awful strange woman," I said. "There ain't another like you in the world." "That's okay," she said. "See how this stretches the elastic," she said, sticking out her stomach again when she started dressing. She had just got into her underpants. "I thought it was supposed to make women less exciting," I said. "It sure hasn't you." She flopped back on the bed and laughed a big one. I liked the way Molly laughed. "These sheets are still nice and cool," she said. I was done half-dressed, but I lay back down a minute and grinned and kissed her. "And you're my honey," she said. In a minute we got up and dressed. I showed her the deed, but it didn't impress her a snap's worth. But I must have impressed her a little. She wouldn't hardly turn loose of me that day. "Gid, have you got time to see what's wrong with my windmill?" she said. "It just barely has been drawing lately." "Sure, come on out with me," I said. "I'll be out in a minute," she said. "I want to pin up this old hot hair." She raised her arms to pin it. I got a pair of pliers and a couple of wrenches out of her toolbox and climbed to the top of the pipe. It was just the sucker rod loose, and I tightened it in 2 minutes. But I didn't climb down. I rested a minute on the crossbars while I waited for Molly to come out. Dad was the only thing missing in life. I hated it that he had missed such a good year for cattle. It was just the kind of year he had always waited for. From where I sat, I could see my new land. I had my hand on the top of the pipe, and the damn rod went down and mashed my finger before I noticed. I damn near fell off, but caught myself. I had a blood blister to suck, and a big one. Some grayish clouds were building up in the northwest, so we might get rain. Molly stepped out on the back porch, buttoning her shirt with her hair pinned up high in a knot and her neck looking cool. "Come on down," she said. "I'll get a crick in my neck looking up there." "I'm surveying my new land," I said. "Except for your place, I own everything west of here that I can see." "You and your land," she said. "You ain't getting mine. Come on down here to me." She was shading her eyes and looking up. So I climbed down. "I like to pinch my finger off," I said. "I better get on home before I get in more trouble." She took my mashed finger and put it in her mouth and wet it. The finger still stung, but I didn't much want to go home. "You're supposed to kiss it," I said, "not slobber on it." "I can't feel him yet," she said. "I ought to pretty soon." "One of these days I'll repipe your windmill," I said, and then I remembered Eddie. Molly looked a lot thinner with her hair up on her head. It made her look cool and tender. "I see you ain't interested in babies," she said. "Come with me to milk. It's cool enough now." I got the bucket. The old brindle cow was already in the lot waiting. "Want me to milk?" "No, she don't like strangers. You'd have to hobble her." So I put the feed in the stall, and old Brindle went in. Molly got out her milking stool from under the trough and sat down on it and went to milking. The old cow was an easy milker, but she kept switching her tail at flies and hitting Molly in the face. I got tickled. "Here," I said, "I'll hold her tail." The old cow never noticed. "If she ever steps on your foot, you'll learn to wear shoes," I said. I squatted down by her and put my free hand on the back of her neck, where her skin was cool. I slipped my hand on under her shirt and rubbed her back and belly a little. A trickle of sweat slid along her ribs from her armpit. "I wish I understood you," I said. "I never know just what you want from me. You'll make a good milker yourself." I felt in front, and she grinned. "I just want your lovin' and a little less conversation," she said. We left old Brindle in the lot, eating prairie hay. I carried the milk bucket, and she put her arm around my middle. We walked up to where my horse was tied. I set the milk bucket over in the yard and came back and kissed her bye. She poked her belly against me. But I got on my horse anyway, and she stood there grinning, fiddling with her shirt tails. "Oh, I'm glad, Molly," I said. "I just got this new land on my mind. I better go. I'm getting lonesome for you, and I ain't even left yet." "I guess I know what's good," she said. "Say hello to Mabel." "I will. You say hello to Eddie." It was a kind of joke. If either of us actually did, it was her. She was just that crazy. "If I come by again in a day or two, will you chase me off?" I said. "That's one thing I've never been guilty of," she said. The little barn swallows come out and began to flitter around, and she looked up at them. "I love the cool of the evening," she said. I loped across the hill and left her standing by the fence, fiddling with her shirt tails. It was strange, riding off from Molly. I never done it in my life that I didn't want to turn and go back a dozen times before I got out of sight. She always stood right where you left her, as long as she could see you. I remembered her in the kitchen that afternoon, all sweaty and loving, drinking the dipper of water and her throat wet. I felt like Molly was just as permanent as my land. Old Denver wanted to tear out for the barn, but I held him to a lope, and we got to the lots just as the sun was going down behind the ridge. Part 2. Ruin hath taught me. Ruin hath taught me thus to ruminate, that time will come and take my love away. Shakespeare, Sonnet 64. Chapter 1. Johnny came in one afternoon and caught me crying. I had been listening to Kate Smith. "My God, cheer up, Molly," he said. "You're going to ruin the oilcloth." "Sit down," I said. "I know it's silly." I got up and poured him a cup of coffee, and he blew on it a while and didn't say anything, and finally he reached over and squeezed one of my hands. "Now look, quit this stuff," he said. "It's a beautiful day. You ought to be out making a garden instead of sitting in here like this. What brought it on?" "Oh, the radio," I said, "listening to Kate Smith. Every time I do that I get blue, and not because of her, because of the songs. God bless America, land that I love." She always sang that. I just wanted the war over and my boys home, my boy home. "Aw, quit listening to all this patriotic stuff," he said. "It's just depressing and it don't do no good." "You make me mad," I said. "It wouldn't hurt you to be a little more patriotic. You ain't gonna cheer me up talking that way. I just wish we knew something definite about Joe." He rubbed my hand and drank his coffee. "Well, I do too, honey," he said. "He was my boy too. But imagine he's dead. Be better for us to face it. Missing over a year. We can't just sit here and quit." He made me get up and go outside with him, and he was right. It was a real pretty day. Being outside cheered me up. We sat on the cellar a while, and he took his hat off and put his arm around me. "I knew you'd smile sooner or later," he said. "Look how tall my corn's getting," I said. 3 more weeks and I can cook you some roasting ears. Where's your boss today?" "He's off trying to buy him another ranch for me to take care of," he said. "Gid's plain land crazy." "Well, you just let him go ahead." Johnny was always trying to slow Gid down. Everybody's some kind of crazy. It was so clear we could see half the county. May was usually my favorite month. "What kind of crazy are you?" Johnny said. "Just plain crazy," I said. "I haven't got enough brains to be any other kind." Then he leaned over and kissed me. I figured he was getting about ready to. He'd had it in his mind ever since he came in. "Well, Molly, I'm woman crazy," he said, holding my shoulders and grinning his old reckless grin. He tickled me. I couldn't help loving Johnny, even when I wasn't much in the mood for him. Even when he was acting the soberest, there was something about him that was like a boy. He never lost it, and it was one of the nicest things about him. When he was around, I could have a boy and a man in the same person. Not like Gid at all. Gid had never been a boy. I guess his dad never gave him the chance. And that was why Jimmy was so much harder for me to raise than Joe. I never had any trouble handling Johnny and Joe. "You want to help me tie up my tomato plants?" I said. "I might as well do that today." "Well, now, you might as well not either," he said. "I'd like to be treated like company for once, not like a damn hired hand. If I'm going to have to work, it'd just as well be for Gid. He pays me." "Pardon me," I said. "You was the one that mentioned gardening." "Yeah, but you had the war blues then. Actually, while I'm here, I came a-courting." He kissed me again. He was so funny. "Why, yes, honey, I'll marry you," I said when he quit. "Just let me go get my pocketbook so we can pay the preacher." That always embarrassed him, even if he knew I was kidding. If there was ever a bachelor, it was Johnny McLeod. "Ah, hush," he said. "I'd just as soon marry an alligator." It really got off with Johnny when I mentioned marrying. I should have quit doing it. I guess Gid kidded him about it all the time, and he was probably ashamed of himself for not wanting to marry me. If he had ever really asked me, I could have really turned him down, and he wouldn't have felt that way anymore. I wouldn't have married again anyhow. Eddie was enough husband for me, at least not Johnny. Gid I might have, but that was a different story. "Well, I guess the tomatoes won't get tied up," I said, and took his arm. I wasn't too eager to go in the house with him then. For one thing, it was so pretty outside, but he was eager to go with me, so it was okay. I was the only woman Johnny had ever been able to count on, and I usually tried to give him what he needed. It wouldn't have been very loving of me not to. He had a big, ugly-looking blue spot on his hip where he said a horse had pitched him off against a tree stump, and I went in the pantry and got the liniment and made him lay back down while I rubbed some on it. "You're sure nice to me," he said. "I'd have probably been crippled years ago if it hadn't been for you." "It don't take much to rub on liniment," I said. "You could have done that much already if you weren't so careless of yourself." "It's so much more pleasant when you do it," he said. "You can rub my back a little if you just insist." That was another difference in Johnny and Gid. Once Johnny got in a bed, no matter for what reason, he'd think of excuses to stay there for hours on end. Gid was just the opposite. You practically had to tie him down to keep him in bed 10 minutes. I'd been trying to break him of it for nearly 20 years. I hadn't made no progress, and in fact I'd lost ground. When we were both younger, I could entice him to relax once in a while. But the older we got, the less luck I had. Mostly, I guess it was because Gid had so much energy he couldn't hardly stay still. But partly it was because he was ashamed of himself for being there in the first place, especially if it was in the daytime. At night, he wasn't as bad, but then I never got to see much of him at night. Not Johnny. He could lay around and enjoy himself for hours. "Say, Molly," he said. He was lying there watching me. He was such a watcher it tickled me sometimes. "What'll you take to patch my breeches pocket before I get them back on? I'm afraid I'll lose my billfold and all them valuables in it." "I may not have any blue thread," I said. "That's all right, I ain't particular." I put my brassiere on and patched them for him while he dozed. His clothes were always just on the verge of being worn out. I think he just wore that kind when he visited me so there would be something for me to patch. I watched him sleep. Joe had his features to a T, and his eyes, and his recklessness. If he hadn't had the recklessness, he wouldn't have gotten no bomber crew to begin with. But that pleased Johnny. One day after Joe had already been reported missing, Johnny told me he'd rather have a dead hero for a son than a live coward. "I'd rather have Joe than either one," I said, and I don't think he knew what I meant. Men don't think like women, or maybe it's that they don't feel the same kind of feelings. Gid had said practically the same thing to me when Jimmy got sent to the Pacific. And the boys were the same way, I guess. Joe actually enjoyed living over in England and flying in the bomber. I guess he had 1,000,000 girlfriends over there. I was always afraid he'd marry one of those English girls and bring her home to Texas and not know what to do with her. In his letters, he never mentioned things like that. "How's the place, Mama?" or "What's Gid and Johnny doing?" or "Mama, I sure do miss your cooking. These army chefs sure can't cook like you." Why don't you send me some cookies? Letters like that. Joe was the liveliest kid in the world and the best-natured. I waited till he was 16 to tell him Johnny was his dad. It had bothered Jim so much when he found out Gid was his. But it tickled Joe flat to death. I imagine he pretty well suspected it anyway. But when he grinned at the news, I cried for half an hour. I was so relieved. I doubt Johnny and him ever talked about it. They usually just talked about horses and ball playing and rodeos, things they were interested in. They probably never even mentioned it. Things like that just didn't worry Joe like they did Jimmy. Johnny was sound asleep. He was woman crazy, all right, at least where I was concerned, and he tickled me the way he let me know it. But he wasn't as crazy as he had been. One time, years before, he had come charging into the kitchen in such a hurry that he hadn't even seen me, and knocked me flat on my back. It scared Jimmy to death. I guess the time was coming when Johnny wouldn't barge in on me in the afternoons, and I would miss that, mood or no mood. I put the needle in the pincushion and got back in bed and made him turn over so I could lay against him under one of his arms. I never did doze off. I just lay and looked out the window and counted Johnny's pulse once in a while for the fun of it. It looked like a cloud was building up in the south. Every once in a while Johnny would grunt like a hog, just one grunt, and then be quiet again. One time, straightening out his leg, he scratched me, so I jumped. He was the worst in the world about toenails. Once I gave him a pair of clippers, and he kept them about 2 days and broke them trying to cut a piece of baling wire. The arm I was holding had his watch on it, and when it got to be 6 o'clock, I got up right quiet and put on my dress and cooked supper. Steak and gravy and black-eyed peas was about all we had, but I had a few fresh onions from the garden, and Johnny loved fresh onions. When I went back to the bedroom, the rooms was full of shadows, except for the one west window where the last of the sunlight was coming in. I sat down on the bed and gave Johnny a shake. "Get up if you want any supper," I said. He opened his eyes and stretched. "Oh, hell, you're done dressed," he said, and grinned. "You heard me," I said. "We ain't wrestled in a long time," he said. "You want to?" "Not specially," I said. "I've lost my girlish strength." "You never had none. You was just awful wiggly," he said. I went on and set the table, and he stomped around dressing and washing up for 10 minutes before he ever showed himself in the kitchen. "Boy, where'd you get them onions?" he said. "Have you milked?" "No," I said. "You can milk while I wash the dishes." "These dishes won't need washing," he said, and they didn't much. He went to the barn with me, but I did the milking. He let the cow in and made conversation, but milking was a little beneath his dignity. Gid would grab a hold and do anything, but Johnny was finicky about the things he worked at. A lot of that rubbed off on Joe, only I never let Joe get away with it. One time I sent him out to hoe goat heads, and when I went out to see about him, he was playing with a stick horse and hadn't hoed a lick. "What are you doing?" I said. "I thought I sent you out here with a hoe." He had really worked his nerve up by that time. "Mama, go to hell," he said. "I'm riding. Cowboys don't hoe." "I'll cowboy you, sonny," I said, and I did. Johnny, he laughed about the whole thing and just made Joe worse. So the next time he came loving up to me, I told him a thing or two. "Go court your horse," I said. "Cowboys don't fool around with girls." "Oh, honey, now, you ain't mad at me," he said, but he didn't get nowhere that day. When I finished the milking, Johnny opened the gate so old Muley could go out, and I started to the house with the milk bucket. He came up and put his arm around me and made me slosh some milk out on my foot, so I gave him the bucket to carry. "I never was no hand at milking," he said. "Think of the time it saved me." The only time I ever got Johnny to do chores was the winter after Eddie got killed, when I come down with the flu so bad. Gid and him took turns with my chores until I got over it. Both the boys had it too. It was a warm, pretty evening. I strained the milk and Johnny poured himself some coffee. I got a jar of plum preserves and opened it for him. He loved to drink coffee and eat plum preserves. After he had spit about 100 seeds into his coffee saucer, I took the jar away from him and put it back in the icebox. "It's a wonder you haven't took sugar diabetes, as much sweet stuff as you eat," I said. "It's a wonder I haven't tooken something worse than that from associating with old widow women like you," he said. I walked over behind him and squeezed his neck a little. "I always get old after supper," I said, In the afternoon, I'm still young and pretty. I've noticed that, he said. I wonder why it is. We sat around a while, and then he put his hat on, and we walked out to the back gate. There were plenty of stars showing, but there was a good bit of lightning back in the west. Well, I guess Gid's bought him another 5 sections by now, he said. It's all I can do to keep him from working me to death. You'd think a man 47 years old would begin to slow down. Gid got a late start, I said. He didn't really catch hold till after his dad died. He's making up for it. Tell him to come and see me, I said. I don't get to see too much of him since they moved to town. And when he did come by, he was in such a hurry I didn't get to talk to him long. He comes by often enough without me telling him to, Johnny said. I'd just as soon not encourage the competition. How are him and Mabel making it, I asked. Oh, they're having trouble, Molly. But when ain't they? At least now they got a house big enough that they can kind of keep out of one another's way. I'm sorry, I said. Gid deserves better. I think so too, he said. We never heard the news tonight. I forgot about it. We didn't miss nothing, he said. You keep up with this war stuff too close. Well, you're an American, I said. Don't you want to know what's happening? Not particularly, he said. When the Japs or the Germans cross the county line, then I'll be interested. I didn't say no more. It was a sore spot with us. There was no change in Johnny. But I think he was sorry he said it because he knew it made me blue. I apologize, honey, he said, patting my arm. I didn't mean to hurt your feelings. Sure enjoyed the meal. I'm glad, I said. I kissed him on the cheek, and he got in the pickup and started off. Then he stopped and leaned out the window. Much obliged for patching them pants, he said. You're welcome. He bounced on across the hill, hitting all the bumps. I could see the taillights bouncing. Johnny was a sorry driver, and so was Gid. Joe and Jimmy could drive circles around either one of their dads. I stood by the fence until the taillights went out of sight. It seemed like I'd spend a lot of my life watching Gid or Johnny or one of the boys drive off across the hill. That was all right. I enjoyed being there, where they could find me if they took a notion to come back, and they always had. After I watched the clouds a while, I decided it wasn't stormy looking enough to worry, so I went in and went to bed. Chapter 2. It wasn't but a few nights after that it come a real bad cloud. Just before I went to bed, I stepped outside to look around, and it was as pretty a night as anybody could want. I could see every star in the Milky Way. I went back in and read a piece or two in the Reader's Digest and went to sleep. When I woke up, the wind was blowing a gale, and the limbs of the old sycamore tree were thrashing against the roof. I got out of bed and made sure the windows were all down, and then went out on the back porch to see if I could tell anything about the cloud. The wind was out of the southwest and just about took my nightgown off. That was too much wind to sleep under, so I went back to the bedroom and got my bathrobe and a pillow. There was a cot with several quilts on it already made up in the storm cellar. I had learned long ago to have things like that ready. I sat down at the radio a minute and tried to get a weather report, but all I got was static. Anyway, the way the sycamore thrashed was weather report enough. I put an apple in my pocket in case I got hungry, and shut the back door good when I went out. Just as I stepped off the porch, the big raindrops began to splatter me. There was an awful wind, and a big old tumbleweed came swooshing across the yard from the south and bounced right into me. In the dark, I never seen it coming, and it scared me and stung a little, but I got loose from it and went on to the cellar and shut the door after me. The sandstone steps felt cool on my feet. It was pitch dark. I had a kerosene lantern sitting on a table, but before I could work my way over to it, I stumped my toe on an old pressure cooker that was sitting on the floor. I never could remember to throw it away, and I stumped my toe on it practically every time I went to the cellar. From down there I could still hear the wind singing, but it didn't sound dangerous. Nothing sounded dangerous from down in the cellar. I lit the lantern and looked through the quilts to be sure there wasn't no stinging lizard in them. The cellar was clean, and there never had been many stinging lizards down there, but it never hurt to look. Not as much as it hurt to get stung. Then I blew out the lantern and snuggled down in the quilts and ate my apple. It was a nice sweet one and smelled fresh, like it had just come off the tree that day. When I got done, I dropped the core under the cot. I had such a good taste in my mouth. It was one thing I liked about apples. Lately, I had got so I always belched peaches, so I didn't eat them much except in homemade ice cream. I felt nice and cozy and relaxed, snuggled in the quilts, and I wasn't too worried about the storm. Where cyclones were concerned, I was awful lucky. One time, one went right between the house and the barn, and all it done was turn Dad's old wagon over. It never even hurt the chicken house. I thought I would doze right off to sleep, but I didn't. I lay there wide awake. It began to rain real hard. I heard it beating against the tin door of the cellar. After I lay there 30 minutes or an hour, I knew I was going to get real blue before the night was over, and in a little while I began to cry. I didn't even try to stop myself. At first I was just barely sniffling, but then all my feelings rushed up to my chest and my head, and I heard myself crying over the rain on the door. I was crying so hard, I thought I'd fallen off the cot. When I was coughing and trying to get my breath, I pulled back one of the quilts and felt the canvas with my hand, so I hadn't fallen. My breasts just felt like empty sacks. I turned the pillow over on the dry side and cried some more hard crying, and finally I quit and pushed the pillow off the cot and lay on my stomach with my head on my arms. I was all upset and knew I wouldn't go to sleep, but I didn't feel any more like I was going to die. There was no cure for being upset that way. I just had to grit my teeth and wait for the feelings to die down. Being lonesome itself was just part of it. Mostly I couldn't stand not having anybody to do for. I never was happy when I just had myself to do for, or even when I had somebody else wanting to do for me. That was nice, but that wasn't the main point about loving, at least not with me. The main point was having somebody I could let my feelings out on. And I couldn't do that very well at a distance. I needed to have somebody right around close, so I could touch them and cook for them and do little things like that. It was always men or boys with me. I never knew a woman I cared for, not even Ma. Men need a lot of things they don't even know about themselves, and most of them they can't get nowhere but from women. It was easy to do for them most of the time, and it made me feel so comfortable. A lot of times it wasn't easy, of course, but it still felt better to try. With Johnny and Joe it was easy. They were just alike and needed exactly the same kind of handling. With Gid it was sometimes awful hard because Gid was too honest. He never would fool himself or let nobody else fool him, even if it was for his own good. I tried it enough times to know it couldn't be done, especially if he was having hard times with Mabel. It had nearly always been hard with Dad and with Eddie, and it was hardest of all with Jimmy, who was just Gid times 2. At least Dad and Eddie liked themselves, even if they didn't like me, and I could figure out what to do from that. But Jimmy, he never liked himself or me, and that made life hell for him. And he hadn't changed. Wherever he was over there in the Pacific, he was wishing he was somebody else's son besides me. I never even put my hand on Jimmy, not even on his arm, after he found out that Gid was his daddy, and that I was still letting Gid and Johnny get in bed with me. Only I wasn't letting them come, I was wanting them to. Jimmy didn't know that, or didn't understand it, but if he had, he would have just hated me more. I blame some of Jimmy's troubles on religion, but I can't blame them all on it. I have to blame most of them on myself. If I had married Gid instead of Eddie, Jim might have been a happy boy. But if that had happened, Eddie would have killed Gid, or Gid and Johnny would have fell apart, and there might not have even been a Joe. I don't know that I'd done very wrong, but I know that Jimmy's miserable. Some of the time I am, too. 4 men and 2 boys were what I'd had for a life, and laying there on the cot I could picture every one of them plain as day, but there wasn't a one of them I could get my arms around, and right then, that was what I wanted. I would rather have been blind and had the touch than like I was with just the picture. Everybody gets hard nights, though, I guess. It wasn't the first time I'd ever felt sick with my feelings, and I wasn't girl enough to think it would be the last. When you lay around feeling cut off from folks, crazy things go through your mind. I would see men's hands and faces and other parts of them, sometimes even their stomachs, Eddie's or Johnny's or Gid's. Probably if I'd gone on and married Johnny, it would have been good for both of us, but he wouldn't have done it, even if I'd really wanted to. He was too responsibility shy. Besides, it would have made Gid feel terrible. He had wanted to marry me all his life. Once I almost decided to marry Gid. I guess I was just jealous of Mabel. We were in my bedroom. "If you've got the guts to quit her, I'll marry you," I said. "If you don't, I wish you'd quit wishing out loud." That was when Gid was having terrible times at home, and when I said that he looked like he was about to split in two. "Honey, you know it ain't a matter of guts," he said. "If I didn't have that much guts, I wouldn't be here now. But I don't believe in divorcement. It ain't right. If Mabel wants to do it, she can. I ain't going to." "If it was conscience, you wouldn't be here," I said. "So I still think it's guts." I talked awful to Gid sometimes. I don't know why he didn't choke me. I would nearly drive him crazy. "Well, let's just be quiet for a little while," he said. "Honey, I got to go in 15 or 20 minutes. That made me feel terrible, and I pulled him over to me. We had some rough times, me and Gid, a lot rougher than any I ever had with Johnny, or with Eddie either. Nothing was rough with Johnny, and when things were bad with me and Eddie, it was just because he plain enjoyed being rough and mean to women. I was hardly ever hard on him like I was on Gid. Sometimes I hated Gid, and I never felt that strong about Eddie one way or the other. After I had cried enough and thought about things enough, I finally did go to sleep. It wasn't good sleeping. I felt like I had fever, but I guess I would have slept all morning if Gid hadn't been good enough to come by and see about me. First thing I knew, someone was banging on the cellar door. Down where I was, it was still pitch dark. "I'm down here," I said. "You can open the door." Bright sunlight fell on the steps and across the foot of the cot, and I seen Gid's old boots on the top step and knew it was him. "Well, thank goodness," he said. "Can I come on down? I was scared you'd blown plumb away." He took another step so I could see about to his knees. I sat up and pushed the hair back out of my face. "My Lord," I said, "I've overslept. What time is it, Gid? I bet the milk cow thinks she's forgot." "Oh, it's not too late," he said. "About 7. I can get them chores for you. Can I come down?" "Please come on down here," I said, pulling the quilts up around my middle. "Did the house blow away?" He came on down the steps. I seen his legs and his belly. He was getting a little bulge. And then all of him, standing there kind of grinning at me, but looking like he had been worried. Gid was always my favorite. Sometimes when I seen him, the delight would shoot right through me, as sharp sometimes as a sting. "Well, Molly, I sure was worried about you," he said. "I heard on the 5 o'clock weather report there was 2 tornadoes sighted out this way." "Oh, sit down here," I said. "I'm all right." And when he sat down on the cot, I couldn't keep from hugging him. He hadn't shaved that morning, and I felt the bristles on his face against my neck, and his arms squeezing my sides. It made me feel good clear to the bottom. He was tense and tight as a drum. Gid always came to me tense. I held him and rubbed my hand on his neck and down his back, and in about 2 minutes he kind of sighed and let things loosen inside him. "I don't know what I'd do if you was to blow away," he said. "Hush," I said, "I won't." I made enough room on the cot that he could lay down by me. It wasn't comfortable, but for a few minutes it was okay. I felt like myself again. Then Gid got embarrassed that I would think he came for bedroom stuff. As many times as he had come for that, he still got embarrassed if he thought I knew it, and he sat up. "Well, I never meant to come out here and go back to bed," he said, picking his hat up off the floor. "I guess you're the silliest man alive," I said. "Maybe that's why I love you so much. When you were young, I didn't think you were silly at all." I got up, too, and slipped my bathrobe on, and we went up the steps and outside. The yard grass was wet and cool against my bare feet, but it was a clear day, and the sun was drying things up fast. I guess it was the latest I'd slept in 2 or 3 years. There were a lot of broken limbs and leaves and tumbleweeds in the yard, and it had blown a few shingles off the roof, but I didn't see any serious damage. Gid went around the house inspecting everything, but I felt too good to worry about wind damage. I stood by the cellar, yawning and stretching the kinks out of myself, soaking up the sun. Gid went in the house and got the milk bucket and came and stood by me a minute. He had a look on his face that meant he really wanted to spend the day with me, but wanted to do 50 other things, too. "I'll go milk," he said. "I never ate breakfast in town. I could eat with you. I got a million things to do today." I rubbed my head against his neck. It embarrassed him a little. "Go on and milk," I said. "I'll get breakfast. But you needn't be planning on rushing off." "I got to, Molly," he said. "I just wish I didn't." I went in and cooked a big breakfast, eggs and bacon and biscuits and gravy, and pretty soon he came in with the milk. We sat down and ate. "What do you hear from Jimmy?" he said while we were drinking coffee. "Nothing." And that was all he said during breakfast. I knew he was getting up his nerve to leave. "Well, that was a good breakfast," he said, pushing back his chair. "I hate to eat and run, but I guess I better. I got many a mile to make today." "Don't leave this morning, Gid," I said. "Just stay around here." When I came right out and asked him flat like that, he had to at least look at me. He was too honest just to dodge behind his hat. "You need me to help you do something?" he said. I could have slapped him for saying that. I needed him to help me live. "No," I said, "I just like to be around you." It was like I had run a needle into his quick. He shoved his hands in his pocket and shook his head. He didn't say anything, and I sipped my coffee. "I'm glad you do," he said finally. "I'd like to stay a month, but you know what I'm up against. I got a few more obligations than you have." I felt miserable for being so hard on him, but I got harder in spite of it. "Okay," I said. "Come back next time there's a storm." "Oh, now be fair," he said, and I could tell he was trembling. "I got things I have to do. I'm a husband. Can't you understand that?" "I understand you ain't going to stay," I said. "It's pretty plain what you don't want to do." Before I could finish saying it, he had stepped over and yanked me out of the chair so quick I didn't even see his hand, grabbed my hair and yanked my head back so tears sprang out of my eyes, and my face was about 2 inches from his. But after he held me that way a minute, his hands began to tremble. "I'm sorry, Gid," I said, and we walked outside together and stood in the yard. "I'm the most worthless white man alive," he said. "I'll stay a week." "No, honey, go on and work," I said. "You got some gloves? We might as well patch up them old corrals of yours." We went down to the barn, and he got out the tools, and we spent the whole morning patching on the lots, putting a new board in here and there, and resting with one another and doing odds and ends and talking. We just piddled and enjoyed it. Then I fixed him a big dinner, and about 2 o'clock hugged him and sent him on. He was thinking about taking me in the bedroom, but I didn't encourage him. If he had that day, he would have been down on himself for a month and wouldn't have come to see me all that time. If we held off, he'd be back in a day or two when he felt easier, and it would be better for him. Gid was a complicated person, but I had been studying him for a long time, and I knew his twists. We had given one another a lot of good times, of one kind or another, since that summer I got pregnant with Jimmy. That seemed an awful long time ago. I guess the times we spent together, the good ones, not the bad ones, there were enough of them too, were the best times either one of us ever had. 3 days later, about the middle of the afternoon, Gid came back over. I had been working in the hen house all day and was sweated down, but I was still glad to see him. I wiped off my face and took him right in the house. Chapter 3. One day, about the middle of June, a man from up around Vernon came by and wanted to sell me some alfalfa hay. I hadn't bought any alfalfa in 3 years, and it sounded cheap enough, so I told him to go ahead and bring me 10 ton. He said he'd be there with it the next day. That afternoon, about 3 o'clock, I put on my overalls and got the hoe fork and climbed up to see what I could do about cleaning out the loft. I didn't want the men to have to do it when they got there with the hay. It was a pretty hot day for that time of the year. I turned on the faucet at the water trough and washed my face and got a big drink before I climbed up. Working in the loft was like working in an oven. I opened the loft doors at both ends so there would be a little ventilation. There was plenty to do, I seen that. The loft probably hadn't been cleaned out since Dad built the barn. The wastage and chaff from all the hay we'd put up was about shin deep all over the loft, and it was full of all kinds of mess that Dad had left around and I never had bothered. Baling wire and hay hooks and buckets and whatnot. I got to poking around, and there was every kind of nest you could imagine in the old loose dry hay. Rats' nests and mice nests and cats' nests and barn owls' nests and possum nests and probably even a skunk nest or two, if skunks can climb. Maybe a time in the winter I would go up in the loft and find a big old mama possum curled up in the hay, snoozing where it was warm. There were 15 or 20 rotten bales of leftover hay that wasn't good enough to feed, so the first thing I did was get a hay hook and drag those over and shove them out the north loft door. That way the milk cows could find them and eat what they wanted of them. I left one bale to sit on. Moving the bales was work itself, and when I got done, I could feel the sweat dripping down my legs and down my sides. I dragged my sitting bale over by the south door, where I could get some breeze, and rested a while. From the loft, I could see way off south to where Gid's fence line ran across Idiot Ridge. I wished I could see more of Gid. I missed him when I didn't get to see him regular, but I guess he came over every time his conscience would let him. I never had been able to talk Gid out of his conscience, or love him out of it either. I had tried both ways. Me and Gid were in a situation where neither one of us could completely win, and I used to wonder why we let ourselves get that way. Maybe we didn't. I don't know that there are situations where you can completely win, not where you can completely win something important. A lot of medium-sized thunderheads were blowing around in the sky so that patches of shadow would come over the pastures, and sometimes right up to the barn. Then the clouds would go on north, and it would be bright and sunny till another bunch came along. When I had rested enough, I got up and took the hull fork and went to raking the wastage out the loft door. The old stuff was so matted down that it made hard raking. I was always scaring out rats. Most of them run along the rafters till they found a hole and went down into the saddle house or the oat bin. When Jimmy and Joe were little boys, they used to take their rat terrier up in the loft and let him kill rats. It was how we lost that dog, actually. One day he ran a big rat out the loft door and went right out after it. The dog broke his neck and the rat got away. Joe come running up to the house screaming. He was just heartbroken. It was the first time anything he loved had died. I picked Joe up and ran down to the barn, and Jimmy had already carried the dog over by the post pile and was digging a hole to bury him. He was crying, but he wasn't hysterical. He had had one dog die of a rattlesnake bite. Joe couldn't understand why he was putting Scooter in the ground. "We don't want the buzzards to eat him," Jimmy said, but Joe didn't know what a buzzard was. He had crying fits for 3 weeks after that. I had raked out the east side pretty thorough and was trying to make a start in the northwest corner when my fork struck something that made a glassy sound. And of all things, I fished up one of Dad's old whiskey jugs. It surprised the daylights out of me. No telling how long it had been back in that corner. It was still corked and had whiskey sloshing around in it. Nobody had touched it since the day Dad set it in the corner. I laid my hull fork down and picked up the jug and went back to my sitting bale. I felt real strange. Picking up the jug brought Dad back to me, and it gave me the weak trembles. Dad's beard and his hat pulled down over his eyes. When I pulled out the stopper and put my nose to the mouth of the jug, the strong whiskey fumes went right up my nostrils and made my eyes water.